Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Organizing a society of 10 to 12 million people, constructing massive fortresses out of 100-ton stone blocks, and feeding a standing army across some of the harshest mountains on Earth requires, it requires immense resources.
It does, yeah. And usually when we look at historical equivalents, like the Roman Empire or the Han Dynasty, we find a common denominator for managing that kind of scale.
Right, you find coinage, you find commercial markets.
Exactly. You see merchants haggling over the price of grain and, standardized ledgers recording debts in silver or copper or gold.
Because the entire foundation of a complex, sprawling state just seems inherently linked to the existence of a monetary system.
It's a foundational expectation in economic history, really. When a state reaches a certain density and scale, we just expect to see a dedicated medium of exchange.
Like a physical representation of abstract value.
Yeah, something that can be handed from one individual to another to distribute goods, because relying on direct barter just becomes overwhelmingly inefficient at that scale.
But when we examine the Inca Empire, historically known as Tawantinsuyu, that entire economic assumption simply evaporates.
It really does. It completely disappears.
We are looking at a highly organized civilization that flourished across the Andes from 1438 to 1532.
And we are talking about a massive footprint here.
Right, over 770,000 square miles, stretching from modern-day Colombia all the way down to central Chile.
And they achieved unprecedented infrastructural and agricultural success across all of it.
Yet, they managed to feed their population, engineer these massive public works, and sustain a complex military entirely without the use of money.
No commercial markets at all.
No currency, and absolutely no professional merchant class.
Which forces us to completely reevaluate how a macroeconomy can actually function. I mean, the Inca state operated a centrally planned logistical network of a massive scale, and they did it navigating extreme ecological verticality.
And using a completely different set of levers to do it.
Right. They didn't rely on the profit motive or, price discovery to dictate what was produced or where it was sent.
So our focus for this deep dive is to explore exactly how they engineered this system. We're going to look at the mechanics of Tawantinsuyu, addressing you, the listener, to examine how they organized human labor down to the individual household.
And how they manipulated the geography of the Andes to their advantage.
Right. We'll break down their labor taxation, their heuristic agricultural science, and their non-alphabetic accounting methods.
And ultimately, the inherent fragility of maintaining total top-down control.
So to understand the mechanics of this system, where do we start?
Well, we have to start by consciously setting aside our modern definitions of commerce.
Like discarding the concepts of buying, selling, and profit completely.
Exactly. Modern economists and anthropologists analyze the Inca structure through a framework established by the Austrian economist Karl Polanyi.
Yeah.
Polanyi introduced this concept of the embedded economy.
Let's break down what an embedded economy actually means in practice then.
Sure. So in a modern market-based society, the economy often functions as its own distinct sphere, right? It's driven by the logic of supply and demand and by price mechanisms.
So if you want a resource, you just purchase it.
Yeah, regardless of your personal relationship with the seller. But in an embedded economy, that separate sphere just doesn't exist.
The economic system is entirely baked into the culture.
Right. It's governed by cultural, religious, and social institutions.
So the distribution of goods is not dictated by purchasing power at all. It's dictated by social obligation and kinship.
Yes. The state orchestrates the movement of resources based on a heavily scaled-up version of local Andean traditions.
Traditions like solidarity and mutualism.
Exactly, just transformed into imperial policy. The academic consensus defines the Inca economy as this massive redistributive engine.
Meaning the state apparatus extracts labor and resources from the populace, pools those resources in central repositories, and then redistributes them downward.
Downward to fulfill social, religious, and political obligations, yeah. It's a system built on hierarchical cooperation rather than competitive exchange.
To put the distinct nature of this system into sharp relief, it really helps to contrast the Incas with another massive powerhouse operating at the exact same time.
You mean the Aztec Empire in Mesoamerica?
Exactly, because if you walked into the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, specifically into the great market of Tlatelolco, you would be completely overwhelmed by commerce.
The sources describe tens of thousands of people gathering there daily.
Right. You would see rows upon rows of goods being traded. Maize, obsidian, feathers, slaves, gold dust.
And crucially, the Aztecs actually utilized standardized currencies.
They use cacao beans, right?
Yeah, specific grades of cacao beans.
Right.
And standardized lengths of woven cotton cloth, which were known as quashli, to conduct these transactions.
They had a very complex system of pricing, and they had an entire social class dedicated to this commerce, the Pachpeca.
The Pachteca were highly privileged, professional, long-distance merchants.
They organized these massive armed caravans, traveled far beyond the empire's borders to acquire luxury goods, and traded them for immense personal profit.
They accumulated private wealth. They even acted as spies and diplomats for the Aztec state. The market was a roaring, independent force within the empire.
But then, if you shift your perspective to the Inca capital of Cusco during that exact same era, and you looked for the equivalent of Tlatelolco, you'd find nothing.
Just the silence of the marketplace. That is really what defines Tawantinsuyu.
You would find no merchants trading goods for personal accumulation. The Inca system relied almost exclusively on state-directed redistribution and highly localized, kin-based exchange.
There was simply no social class whose occupation was buying low and selling high.
And this total state control was really rooted in how they conceptualized the land itself, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. In the Inca system, the state theoretically owned everything, but they categorized agricultural land into three distinct, highly regulated divisions.
Okay, let's go through those. The first division was the land for the sun, right?
Right. The harvest from this land supported the massive religious institutions. So the priesthood, the maintenance of temples, and the resources required for continuous ceremonial sacrifices.
And the second division was the land for the Inca.
Yes. This was state land. The produce generated here went directly into the imperial administration's stockpiles.
Which fed the army, supported the bureaucracy, and filled the regional storehouses.
Exactly. And then the third division was the land for the ayllu.
The ayllu being the foundational social and economic unit of the Andes.
Right. It's an extended kin group. You can kind of think of it as a community that holds a specific territory collectively.
They trace their lineage back to a common ancestor, often connected to a specific geographical feature.
Yeah, and every single community across the empire was required to work all three categories of land.
But the sequence of that labor is key here. The community didn't just simply work their own land and pay a portion of the yield as tax.
No, the state dictated the precise order of operations.
The community was required to first work the lands of the sun, tending to the religious crops.
Then they moved on to work the lands of the state.
And only after those obligations were totally fulfilled were the members of the ayllu permitted to work their own designated lands for their personal household subsistence.
Right. Their own survival came last in the labor sequence.
Looking at this rigid structure from a logistical perspective, a pretty fundamental economic problem emerges.
The lack of price signals.
Exactly. In a market economy, price signals are the communication network. Prices tell producers what the population needs.
Right. If severe frost destroys a potato crop in one region, potatoes become scarce.
The price of potatoes goes up, which signals farmers in unaffected regions to transport their potatoes there to capture the higher profit. It naturally rebalances the supply.
But if you remove currency and you remove the market, you completely remove that price signal.
So without that signal, how did the central Inca administration actually know what to produce, where to produce it, and in what quantities?
Well, they solved the absence of price signals by replacing them with exhaustive demographic data and rigid state quotas.
They just bypassed consumer demand entirely.
Completely. The state didn't survey the population to see what goods they desired. Production was driven by top-down mandates based on meticulous census records.
So state administrators would look at a province. The census indicates, say, there are exactly 5,000 able-bodied workers in that specific region.
Right. And the state then simply issues an order. This province will produce a precise quota of maize, or a set number of woven tunics, or quarry a specific volume of stone blocks.
Based purely on the available labor pool, not on what people wanted to buy.
Exactly. And the objective of these top-down quotas was not to achieve a perfectly balanced market equilibrium.
What was the goal then?
The overarching economic strategy of the Inca state was massive structural overproduction. The state mandate was to generate and stockpile enormous continuous surpluses.
Which actually makes complete sense when you look at the environment they were operating in. The Andean climate is incredibly volatile.
Agricultural success is never guaranteed there.
You have severe droughts, sudden torrential floods, and the highly disruptive cyclical weather patterns of El Niño oscillations.
Right. So the state's economic model was essentially a brute force approach to risk management.
By demanding production quotas that far exceeded the immediate consumptive needs of the empire, they created a physical, caloric buffer against environmental variability.
Exactly. If an El Niño event wiped out the coastal harvests, the state already had years of surplus stockpiled in the highlands to redistribute and absorb the shock.
But to generate agricultural surpluses of that immense magnitude, without the use of financial incentives to drive production, the Incas had to physically master the extreme geography of the Andes Mountains.
And the way they achieved this was through a land use strategy utterly distinct to the Andean region.
This brings us to the vertical archipelago model.
Right. This framework was formalized by the anthropologist John V. Murrah in the mid-20th century.
Murrah dedicated years to analyzing 16th century Spanish visitas, right?
Yeah, the visitas were intensive administrative and demographic surveys.
So when the Spanish arrived and began establishing colonial control, they sent administrators out to conduct exhaustive interviews with the indigenous populations.
They recorded exactly how these communities had organized their land, labor, and resources under the Inca system. It created a highly detailed snapshot of the pre-existing economy.
And by studying these visitas, Murrah identified a pattern that completely changed the academic understanding of Andean economics.
Because normally when we examine historical states expanding their agricultural base, we see horizontal expansion.
Right. A community clears the forest next to their village, or a kingdom conquers the contiguous land on its border, pushing its perimeter steadily outward across a flat or consistent landscape.
But the vertical archipelago model describes a completely non-contiguous strategy.
Instead of expanding outward in a solid block, Andean communities established satellite settlements spread across drastically different altitudes.
Right, they look like a chain of islands, hence the term archipelago, just separated by elevation rather than ocean.
The Andes Mountains present this very unique ecological opportunity. They offer vastly different microclimates and ecological niches within a relatively short physical distance, simply by moving vertically up or down the mountainy slopes.
And a single ayllu understood that holding all of their agricultural land at one specific elevation was just an unacceptable risk.
Because if a localized frost hits a specific valley at 3,000 meters and all your crops are there, the entire community faces starvation.
Exactly. So to mitigate this, let's trace the physical layout of a typical ayllu using this strategy.
Okay, let's look at the core settlement.
The nucleus, where the majority of the population resides, sits high up in the puna.
The Puna being the cold, high-altitude plateau, situated at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level.
Right. The air is extremely thin and the nights are freezing.
So in the Puna, the agricultural options are highly specialized. The community cultivates hardy root vegetables, primarily various strains of potatoes.
Also, oca and uluku, which can survive the frost.
And they manage massive pastoral herds of llamas and alpacas up there too.
Utilizing the high grasses for grazing, this gives them wool for textiles and a reliable source of meat.
But surviving solely on potatoes and llama meat doesn't provide a very resilient or nutritionally complete diet.
No, it doesn't. So this high-altitude community takes action. They send members of their own extended families down the mountainside.
Like a multi-day walk.
Yeah, descending thousands of meters until they reach the Quisuas, which are the temperate middle valleys.
Down in the Quisuas, situated roughly between 2,000 and 3,000 meters, these family members establish a permanent satellite colony.
And the climate down there is significantly warmer and more stable.
It's the optimal environment for cultivating maize.
Maize was highly valued, not just for its dense caloric content, but ritually. It was the essential ingredient for brewing chicha beer.
Which was necessary for basically all social and religious ceremonies.
Right, and the vertical expansion doesn't stop in the middle valleys.
The ayllu sends other family members even further down, descending toward the Yungas.
The Yungas being the hot, humid, tropical foothills, located either on the eastern slopes descending toward the Amazon basin or the western slopes descending toward the Pacific coast.
And down in these tropical lowland colonies, the community members are harvesting entirely different resources.
They cultivate coca leaves down there,
which are absolutely vital for religious rituals, social exchange, and for chewing to mitigate the severe effects of altitude sickness when they travel back up the mountain.
They also harvest cotton for weaving, orgy peppers for preserving and flavoring food, and they gather fruit and timber.
And because these satellite colonies at the different elevations are all populated by members of the exact same extended kin group, They do not engage in trade.
Right, the colony in the Middle Valley doesn't sell maize to the core settlement in the High Plateau.
They simply share the total harvest.
It is an internal reciprocal exchange system based entirely on kinship obligations.
So the maize harvested in the temperate Kiswas flows continuously up to the cold Puna. The freeze-dried potatoes and llama meat from the Puna flow down to the tropical Yungas.
And the coca and cotton from the Yungas flow back up to both the Middle Valleys and the High Plateau.
By structuring their society this way, a single extended community becomes entirely self-sufficient across multiple, completely different climate zones.
They insulate themselves from the failure of any single crop. If the potato harvest in the highlands fails one year, the maize from the Middle Valleys and the provisions from the lowlands sustain the entire group.
What's really notable about this is that the Incas did not invent this strategy of vertical complementarity.
No, the archaeological record demonstrates that this localized survival strategy predates the Inca Empire by many centuries.
We can observe early iterations of this vertical integration in older Andean civilizations, like the Wari and Tiwanaku cultures.
Right, groups that exerted significant influence over the region from roughly the year 600 to the year 1000.
The Inca genius wasn't in inventing the archipelago, but in weaponizing it.
Exactly. They took this local survival mechanism and co-opted it on a massive imperial scale.
The Inca state used its absolute authority to forcibly resettle entire populations, a policy known as mitmakuna.
They would uproot specific groups and move them across the empire to establish massive, state-directed agricultural colonies in different ecological zones.
This ensured that a continuous, diverse flow of resources, maize, coca, cotton, timber, metals, flowed directly into the state stockpiles and ultimately to Cusco.
Completely bypassing any need for regional trade networks.
Managing vast agricultural fields that are a multi-day walk apart, situated across some of the steepest and most challenging terrain on the planet, requires an immense amount of coordinated physical effort.
A family unit just cannot maintain terraces at 3 different altitudes without help.
And this heavy reliance on physical labor brings us to the absolute core engine of the Inca economy.
In the Inca system, labor was the definitive currency. It was the primary economic input, and it was the singular form of taxation.
The state did not tax its citizens by demanding a percentage of their personal household goods, and they certainly did not demand coin.
No, the state taxed the population in time, energy, and sweat. Every single able-bodied adult within the empire owed a specific portion of their labor to the state.
To understand the mechanics of how this labor was organized without causing immediate societal collapse, we need to break down the 3 distinct tiers of Andean labor organization: Anani, Minca, and Mita.
Right. And the system starts at the most localized, intimate level with Annie.
Annie represents symmetrical family reciprocity. It's a hyper-local, horizontal exchange of labor between equals.
Right. So if a family needs to construct a new thatched roof for their dwelling, or they need extra hands to rapidly harvest their personal field before a storm hits, they call upon their neighbors and extended family.
And the family receiving the help is socially obligated to provide food and abundant chicha beer to everyone working on the project throughout the day.
But the more crucial obligation is the reciprocal debt.
Right. If your neighbor helps you build your roof, you are bound by strict social custom to provide your labor when they need to clear their field the following season.
It is a balanced one-to-one exchange that binds the local community together without any formal contracts.
The second tier of labor organization scales up to the community level. This is known as Minca.
Minca is communal labor mobilized for the benefit of the entire ayllu. It addresses needs that are just too large for single family to manage through Aini.
Minca is focused on shared infrastructure. For instance, the Andes rely heavily on elaborate irrigation networks.
Right. And if the main canal supplying water to the community's terraces becomes choked with silt and debris, a single family cannot clear it.
So the local leaders will call a Minca. The entire community gathers to work collectively to clear the canal, or maybe repair a collapsed retaining wall, or build a communal storehouse.
And in a Minca, the local leadership organizing the labor is responsible for providing a feast to compensate the workers.
This establishes a slightly asymmetrical relationship. The leaders provide the resources for the feast, and the community provides the labor for the collective good.
Right. Both Ayanani and Minca were deeply ingrained, ancient Andean traditions based on mutual aid and local survival.
The third tier, however, was the imperial adaptation. This was the Mita.
The Mita was the mandatory state labor tax.
Anthropologists like Terence N. Dale Troy and archaeologists like John Hyslop have documented extensively how the Mita functioned as a massive, continuous, rotating labor draft.
The concept of rotation is central to understanding the system. The state did not operate a system of permanent chattel slavery for its general workforce.
Based on the meticulous demographic data recorded in the censuses, provincial governors would demand a specific quota of men from a given community for a set, temporary period, perhaps 2 or 3 months out of the year.
These drafted laborers were ordered away from their homes to execute the state's massive projects.
They were sent to the frontiers to serve in the imperial military. They were sent to the high-altitude mines to extract silver and copper.
They were deployed to build the thousands of kilometers of paved roads.
And they were used as the muscle to construct the monumental architecture the Incas are famous for.
Consider the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, situated above the capital of Cusco.
The scale of the stonework there is staggering.
The drafted MIDI workers were moving limestone blocks that weigh over 100 tons, maneuvering them into place with such precision that a blade of grass cannot fit between the joints.
This was achieved purely through coordinated human exertion, orchestrated by the state draft.
And when a worker's assigned rotation was complete, he was permitted to return to his ayllu, and the state immediately drafted the next group to replace him.
Ensuring a permanent, massive workforce was always at the state's disposal.
The scholar Yechek Christo proposed a specific analytical framework for understanding the deeper mechanics of this labor draft. He calls it the PASCAP model, which stands for process as the goal.
Christo argues that we misunderstand the Mita if we view it merely as a necessary evil to build a road or a temple.
He suggests that the sheer act of mobilizing the workforce was, in itself, a primary objective of the Inca state.
The process of moving and exhausting the labor force was an intentional tool of statecraft.
Precisely because it forced the entire system into motion, the Mita simultaneously fulfilled multiple imperial functions.
Yes, it physically built the infrastructure, but it also forced the state to constantly empty and refill its storehouses.
Right, the state was ideologically and practically obligated to feed, clothe, and provide chicha to the Mita workers for the entire duration of their service.
Furthermore, the draft was a tool for social integration. The Inca Empire was a patchwork of conquered territories and diverse ethnic groups.
So by drawing men from a newly conquered province in the north, marching them hundreds of miles, and having them work on a temple alongside men drafted from a completely different province in the south, the state broke down local loyalties.
They forced these disparate groups to interact under the umbrella of Inca authority, physically integrating them into a single imperial system.
The labor draft constantly reinforced the state's total control over the time and bodies of its subjects.
However, we really need to push back against a narrative that sometimes emerges in older historical texts. There's a tendency to heavily romanticize the Mita system.
Yes, some accounts frame it as a grand, empire-wide extension of Aini.
Like a beautiful, cooperative arrangement where the benevolent, fatherly state provides food and security, and the grateful citizens voluntarily offer their labor in a balanced exchange.
Right, but we have to ask, was the Mita truly a cooperative social contract, or was it fundamentally state-sanctioned forced labor?
It is essential to separate the state's ideological propaganda from the physical reality experienced by the workers.
Ideologically, the Incas heavily promoted this narrative of balanced mutual obligation. They consistently framed the Sapa Inca, the emperor, as the ultimate provider and caretaker.
The state provided the materials, the food, and the security, and the people reciprocated with their labor. The state went to great lengths to present this as a balanced scale of cosmic justice.
But the reality on the ground tells a much darker story.
If we look beyond the chronicles and examine modern bioarchaeological data, the romanticized narrative just completely falls apart.
Researchers have analyzed the skeletal remains of individuals who were clearly drafted into state Mita service. These are often found buried near major highland administrative centers or state infrastructure projects.
And the bones show the physical cost of the system.
They really do. The bioarchaeological analysis reveals elevated levels of chronic malnutrition compared to populations living before the imperial expansion.
The skeletons exhibit severe bone lesions, joint degradation, and patterns of intense skeletal stress that are entirely consistent with exhausting, coerced physical labor.
This was definitely not a voluntary community project.
Furthermore, participation was enforced through absolute coercion. Evasion of the Mita draft, or a community's failure to meet its assigned labor quotas, was met with brutal state violence.
Punishments for defiance or failure included severe physical reprimand, the removal of local leaders, and frequently, execution.
While the state draped the system in the familiar cultural language of traditional reciprocity, the underlying mechanism was the threat of overwhelming military force.
To fuel this massive coercive engine of labor, to physically provide the millions of calories required to feed an army of stonemasons, road builders, and soldiers, the state needed an agricultural system capable of unparalleled efficiency.
You cannot sustain a rotating draft of hundreds of thousands of workers without massive amounts of food staged and ready for consumption.
Right. And achieving that level of surplus in the Andes requires a deep, granular understanding of ecological mechanics.
The Incas achieved this not through abstract theory, but through a highly localized generational accumulation of knowledge.
They didn't have formal scientific academies or written treatises on agronomy. They relied on what is termed a heuristic practical approach.
By heuristic, we mean learning through continuous physical action. It's the process of trial, error, empirical observation, and the passing down of successful adaptations through communal memory.
Instead of a scientist writing a formula for soil pH, you have generations of farmers noticing that a specific strain of potato survives a hard frost if planted near a rock wall that absorbs the sun's heat.
They take that single physical observation and scale it up into a massive terraforming project.
And that practical approach yielded extraordinary physical adaptations to the landscape.
The most iconic and vital of these are the Andeans, the massive stone-walled agricultural terraces that define the Andean environment.
The geography of the Andes is characterized by extreme slopes. If a farmer attempts to clear and plant on a 40-degree incline, the first torrential rain of the season will wash all the nutrient-rich topsoil straight down into the river gorge,
Rendering the land barren.
Exactly.
So the solution was to fundamentally alter the geometry of the mountains. They literally carved massive continuous steps into the vertical inclines.
But an Andean is not simply a flat piece of dirt carved into a hill. It is a highly engineered, multi-layered structure designed for water management and thermal regulation.
The construction process requires intense labor. First, the middleworkers build a massive retaining wall out of precisely fitted fieldstones.
And these stones serve a dual purpose. They hold the earth back, but they also act as a thermal mass.
During the intense daylight hours, the stones absorb the sun's radiation.
And at night, when the high-altitude temperatures plummet toward freezing, the stones slowly release that stored heat back into the soil, creating a localized microclimate that protects the roots of the crops.
Behind that retaining wall, the terrace is constructed in specific layers.
The bottom layer is filled with large rubble and coarse gravel to ensure rapid water drainage, preventing the roots from rotting.
The middle layer consists of finer sand or smaller gravel.
Finally, the top layer is packed with thick, nutrient-rich topsoil, often physically carried up from the valley floors by the laborers.
These Andeans completely transformed the agricultural capacity of the empire. They halted soil erosion, optimized water retention, and effectively expanded the total arable land available to the state by up to 50%.
The mastery of water was equally critical. They engineered elaborate networks of irrigation canals known as acequias.
These canals tapped directly into high-altitude glacial meltwater and natural springs, routing the water for miles along the contours of the mountains to consistently hydrate the terrace systems.
They also adapted their engineering to the flat, high-altitude regions, specifically around the massive basin of Lake Titicaca.
Here, they utilized a system called camelines, which are extensive networks of raised earthen fields surrounded by deep, intentionally excavated drainage ditches.
The camelones function as massive thermal batteries. During the day, the shallow water filling the drainage ditches absorbs the intense solar radiation.
When the freezing high-altitude night sets in, the water slowly releases that heat upward, creating a protective blanket of warmer air over the raised beds, preventing deadly frosts from destroying the crops.
It is a brilliant, localized manipulation of thermodynamics.
This empirical mastery of microclimates is perhaps best demonstrated at the extraordinary archaeological site of Moray.
Moray is fascinating because it doesn't look like a standard agricultural terrace. It consists of a massive, circular, concentric terraces carved incredibly deep into a natural depression in the earth.
It resembles a giant, stepped amphitheater.
The visual of Moray is striking. The concentric rings step down deeper and deeper into the ground. Scientific studies of the site have revealed its incredible function.
The temperature difference between the highest, outermost terrace ring and the lowest, deepest ring at the center can vary by as much as 15 degrees Celsius.
It is widely understood that Moray functioned as an empirical agricultural research station.
The state administrators could take seeds from newly conquered territories or experimental strains of maize and potatoes and plant them simultaneously on the different levels.
By observing the growth patterns, they could determine exactly which altitude and precise temperature range yielded the maximum harvest. They used this data to dictate exactly what crops the provinces should focus on.
However, producing a massive harvest is only the first step in the logistical chain. The biological reality of food is that it rots.
If the state mandate is to build a surplus that can sustain the empire for 3 to 7 years, they had to develop technologies to preserve the harvest indefinitely.
This brings us to a masterpiece of heuristic engineering, the creation of chuño.
The process of making chuño is a perfect example of utilizing the extremes of an environment rather than fighting them.
Let's look at the mechanics of it. A farming community in the high Puna, situated at over 3,000 meters, harvests a massive crop of native bitter potatoes.
If they just store them in a pile, moisture and rot will destroy the crop within weeks.
To prevent this, they wait for the deepest, coldest months of the Andean winter. As the sun sets, the farmers spread the freshly harvested potatoes out on the frozen ground.
In the thin atmosphere, the nighttime temperatures plummet well below freezing. The potatoes freeze solid.
Inside the potato, the water within the cellular structure expands as it turns to ice. This expansion physically ruptures and shatters the cell walls.
The next morning, the intense, high-altitude Andean sun emerges. The temperature rises rapidly.
The farmers and their families then walk out onto the fields and physically trample the freezing potatoes with their bare feet.
This mechanical squeezing action forces the moisture, which is now melting, out through the ruptured cell walls.
The intense sun then begins to evaporate that moisture. The community repeats this cycle relentlessly for several days, freezing the potatoes at night, then trampling and sun-drying them during the day.
What remains at the end of this intensive process is a completely dehydrated, rock-hard, lightweight husk. This is chuño.
It is essentially a prehistoric method of freeze-drying, utilizing the natural diurnal temperature swings of the mountains as a massive free processing plant.
The utility of chuño to the state cannot be overstated. The freeze-drying process removes the bitter toxins.
It retains almost all the dense caloric value of the original potato, and because the water weight is gone, it is incredibly lightweight and easy to transport across the mountains.
Most importantly, a properly processed batch of chuño can be stored in a dry environment for years, sometimes even decades, without spoiling.
To maximize the yields of all these crops, the Incas also mastered nutrient replenishment. They understood that intensive farming rapidly depletes the soil.
They utilized the massive herds of camelids, systematically collecting llama and alpaca manure to fertilize the highland terraces.
They also executed massive logistical operations to import high-grade fertilizer. They dispatched labor teams to the arid islands off the Pacific coast to mine centuries-old deposits of seabird guano.
They loaded this guano into massive llama caravans and transported it hundreds of miles up into the high Andes.
This created a closed pastoral agricultural loop, moving nutrients across vast distances to sustain intense, continuous farming on otherwise marginal land.
Generating massive volumes of freeze-dried potatoes and high-altitude maize is a monumental achievement. But as a central administration, those calories are only politically and economically useful if you can safely warehouse them and efficiently distribute them across the vast expanse of the empire.
The Inca did not have a subterranean vault filled with gold. Their treasury consisted of physical calories and woven textiles.
To manage this physical wealth, the state engineered the kolkhoz.
The state constructed thousands upon thousands of these specialized stone storehouses.
The physical ruins of the kolkho networks are still heavily visible across the Andean landscape today. They are typically built in long, perfectly aligned rows, situated on the steep hillsides directly above the regional administrative centers.
The architectural placement of the kolkhoz was a deliberate engineered choice. By situating them high on the hillsides, they took advantage of the natural, constant wind currents.
The storehouses were built with specific ventilation channels. The constant flow of cool mountain air circulated through the structures,
which aggressively combated humidity, regulated the internal temperature, and kept pests and fungal rot away from the stockpiles. They were vast, passive-cooled preservation facilities.
Inside these kolkhoz, the state stockpiled the true wealth and power of Tawantinsuyu. They held tons of dried maize on the cob, thousands upon thousands of sacks of chuño, vast reserves of quinoa.
Massive quantities of intricately woven textiles and military uniforms, stockpiles of bronze weaponry, and even dried marine fish brought up the mountains from the coastal provinces.
To truly grasp the logistical scale, we can examine the provincial administrative center of Huanucopampa. This was not the imperial capital of Cusco. This was merely a regional hub designed to manage a specific section of the empire.
Archaeologists surveying the site have documented a staggering storage complex.
The sheer numbers are immense. Depending on the specific architectural criteria used in the surveys, estimates indicate there were hundreds of kolkas at Huanucopampa.
Some detailed counts suggest a range from nearly 500 up to over 4,000 distinct storage structures organized in massive geometric grids at this single regional site.
Calculations based on the total volumetric capacity of the Huanucopampa complex suggest that this single facility held enough surplus to completely sustain a population of 12 to 15,000 people for an extended period, perhaps years.
This is logistical infrastructure operating on a scale that rivaled the grain dole of the Roman Empire. But the Inca system was entirely devoid of commercial logistics.
These massive stockpiles served a critical dual purpose. On a practical level, they were the ultimate buffer against famine and environmental disaster.
But on a structural level, they were the primary mechanism of political control. In the Inca framework, political authority was completely inseparable from the act of provisioning.
This brings us back to the core concept of hierarchical cooperation and the social contract of the state.
The Sapa Inca in Cusco and the local regional governors, the curacas, had to constantly and visibly demonstrate their overwhelming generosity.
They had to legitimize their immense demands for labor by proving they were the source of all abundance.
They achieved this through massive, state-sponsored redistributive feasts. When a local community finished a brutal rotation of the Midadraft, for example, if they had spent 2 months clearing a massive tract of land for a new state farm, the local curaca would officially conclude the work by opening the regional kolkas.
The state would slaughter hundreds of llamas to provide fresh meat. They would bring out massive ceramic vats of chicha beer, brewed from the stockpiled maize.
They would distribute high-quality textiles and garments to the workers. The state provided a highly visible, calorically dense reward.
These feasts were theatrical displays of state benevolence. The underlying political message was unmistakable.
You surrender your time, your autonomy, and your intense physical labor to the state, and in exchange, the state ensures you feast in abundance.
This continuous cycle cemented social cohesion. It made the general populace fundamentally dependent on and appreciative of the central state's logistical capacity.
It was a massive welfare structure that simultaneously functioned as a mechanism of absolute political dominance.
But looking at this massive logistical operation raises a massive, glaring red flag regarding administration.
We are analyzing an empire stretching thousands of kilometers, storing millions of pounds of highly diverse goods, distributed across thousands of separate, specialized storehouses.
And they are managing this entire network without the use of a written alphabetic script. They did not have paper ledgers or clay tablets.
Attempting to manage a heavily centralized supply chain on this scale without writing seems like a recipe for immediate administrative collapse. How could a provincial governor, or the central administrator sitting in Cusco, possibly track what was moving in and out of each kolka?
They managed it by utilizing one of the most sophisticated non-alphabetic administrative technologies in the ancient world.
The Incas bypassed the need for two-dimensional writing by developing a highly advanced three-dimensional physical accounting system.
They encoded massive amounts of data into a physical medium.
This technology is the quipu.
The quipu, sometimes spelled quipu, is a complex recording device. In its physical form, it consists of a thick primary main cord.
Hanging down from this main cord are multiple pendant strings. These strings vary in color, in length, and in the type of fiber used: cotton or camelid wool.
The administrators recorded the data by tying specific, standardized knots into these pendant strings.
So instead of dipping a quill in ink and writing numerals on parchment, they are physically tying data into existence, using cotton cords.
Precisely. And the logic driving the quipu was not arbitrary. It operated on a strict, highly organized base 10 decimal system.
The physical type of knot tied and its vertical position on the pendant string denoted its exact numerical value.
The system worked from bottom to top. The units or singles were tied at the very bottom of the string, the tens were tied above those, the hundreds above the tens, and so on, moving up the string toward the main cord.
Let's visualize how a specific number is read. If you look at a string, and at the very bottom there is a figure 8 knot, that represents the number 1.
Moving up the string to the tens position, you see a long knot wrapped with 4 distinct turns. That represents 40.
Moving further up to the hundreds position, there is a simple single overhand knot representing 100.
You read the string downward, combining the values to get the precise number 141.
The operation of this intricate system was entrusted to a specialized class of state administrators called the quipu.
These were the knot keepers. They were highly trained, dedicated accountants whose entire societal role was to create, maintain, and interpret these physical records.
The quipu used these devices to record the lifeblood of the empire. They recorded the exhaustive demographic census data.
They tracked the precise labor quotas owed by each specific village.
They maintained minute, itemized inventory details of every single good moving into and out of the massive Colca complexes.
The brilliance of the Inca administrative system was that this base 10 decimal logic was not just applied to the strings, it was physically applied to the organization of the population itself.
The state administratively restructured the entire empire into neat, hierarchical decimal units.
They organized households into groups of 10 and assigned a specific local leader to oversee those 10 families.
Those units were then aggregated into groups of 100 households, overseen by a higher-ranking official.
Those were grouped into units of 1,000, then 10,000, each with a corresponding official reporting up the chain.
This rigid decimal structure allowed for a highly efficient, streamlined flow of fiscal and demographic information.
The leader responsible for 10 households would constantly report their local data: how many births occurred, how many deaths, how many young men came of age for the labor draft, exactly how many sacks of tuño were harvested.
They reported this up to the leader of 100. The quipu, stationed at that higher level, would synthesize the data from 10 different lower-level reports, tie a new consolidated quipu, and pass it up to the leader of 1,000.
This unbroken chain of synthesized data continued all the way up the hierarchy to the central administration in Cusco.
This meant the emperor's top logistical planners could consult a master quipu and know exactly how many laborers were currently available in a province 1,000 miles to the north, or track the exact volume of maize available to feed a military regiment marching to the southern frontier.
The chronicles from the early colonial period repeatedly emphasize the absolute numerical precision of the system.
The color coding provided the category. For instance, a yellow string might designate maize, while a red string might designate troops or military equipment, and the knots provided the exact, indisputable quantities.
This is a robust system, but let's examine the mechanics of how it functions in reality. I see a significant vulnerability here.
Because the quipu is a non-alphabetic system, it can record the raw numbers flawlessly, but it cannot explicitly record the narrative context of those numbers.
The knots cannot spell out a sentence saying, "This specific yellow string represents the maize harvest collected from the Chupaichu province in the autumn of 1520.
The system requires the individual quipu memory and the oral tradition accompanying the device to provide the vital context for what the numbers actually signify.
If the accountant dies, or if an accountant decides to actively lie, the strings are just inert pieces of cotton. It seems highly vulnerable to human error or deliberate, localized manipulation.
That is exactly the vulnerability that frustrated the Spanish colonial administrators when they initially attempted to utilize the quipu system for their own taxation purposes after the conquest.
They realized that the integrity of the data relied completely on the honesty and the memory of the individual knot keeper.
However, the Inca state was well aware of this inherent flaw and engineered a robust, bureaucratic countermeasure to ensure data integrity.
How does a state counter administrative fraud when only a specialized elite can read the ledgers, and the ledgers rely on memory?
They achieved data security through a process of aggressive, concurrent public auditing.
The central state did not just trust the local records. They periodically sent high-ranking, independent imperial inspectors from Cusco down to the provinces.
The inspector would convene a public gathering with the local curaca and the local quipu.
Crucially, they required multiple quipu, often representing different levels of the bureaucracy or different local factions, to present their records simultaneously.
Exactly. The inspector would have these different accountants read their separate quipus aloud in each other's presence, actively verifying the totals against one another in real time.
It is analogous to a physical, decentralized ledger system.
If the local village accountant reads his string and claims they delivered exactly 500 sacks of potatoes to the state storehouse, the regional inspector immediately checks his own string, recorded at the storehouse, to ensure it also registers exactly 500.
If there is a discrepancy, the system instantly flags it.
And because this was an authoritarian state, any detected discrepancy or attempted fraud carried severe, often fatal consequences.
By replicating the data and cross-checking it across multiple physical nodes in the administrative hierarchy, manipulating the system required a massive, coordinated conspiracy across multiple levels of government.
That level of collusion was extremely difficult to achieve without detection. The physical auditing process secured the integrity of the cashless economy.
We have established the mechanics of production and administration. They possess the agricultural technology to generate the massive surplus.
They have the thousands of coal cars to warehouse it. They have the intricate quipu system to track every single item.
But an empire is, at its core, a physical logistical network.
Once the central administrators in Cusco receive accurate data indicating that a province in the far north is experiencing a severe drought and requires famine relief, or that an army deployed in the south requires immediate reinforcement and supplies, the state needs the physical infrastructure to move troops and massive amounts of heavy goods across the most unforgiving terrain imaginable.
This physical movement was made possible by the construction of the Capac Ñan, the Great Inca Road.
The Capac Ñan was not simply a trail. It was an astonishing feat of continuous state-directed engineering. The network extended for approximately 40,000 kilometers.
To put that distance in perspective, 40,000 kilometers is roughly equivalent to the entire circumference of the Earth.
This scope is staggering. The network stretched from the borders of modern-day Colombia in the north, running through Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, all the way down into central Chile and Argentina.
The system was structured around two massive primary north-south arteries. One artery ran continuously along the arid desert coast. The other artery cut a path high through the central peaks of the Andean mountain range.
These two main highways were then interconnected by numerous lateral branches that scaled the mountainsides.
What makes this 40,000-kilometer network truly extraordinary is that it was designed, built, and utilized entirely without the use of the wheel.
The Incas did not have carts, they did not have wagons, and they did not have heavy draft animals like horses or oxen to pull them.
The only pack animal available was the llama, which cannot be ridden by an adult human.
Therefore, absolutely everything that moved along the Capac Ñan, every soldier, every message, every ton of chuño was carried by a human being or a camelid.
And the physical road itself was constructed layer by layer using the mobilized muscle of the mitla labor draft.
Because they did not have to accommodate the flat rolling motion of wheeled vehicles, their engineering adapted directly to the extreme vertical environment. They solved geographical obstacles differently.
When the coastal artery crossed the shifting sands of the desert, the workers built low walls lining the road to prevent the dunes from drifting over and erasing the path.
But the true engineering marvels occurred in the high mountains. When the road encountered a massive sheer cliff face, the engineers did not try to blast a gentle sloping ramp into the stone.
Ramps are necessary for wheels. Without wheels, a ramp is inefficient.
So the middle workers carved massive, continuous stone staircases directly into the vertical cliff faces, allowing humans and llamas to simply climb straight up the obstacle.
The infrastructure was perfectly optimized for the specific biological technology they possess.
And where the mountains cracked open, creating massive, plunging river gorges that were impossible to walk around, the engineers utilized suspension bridges.
The mechanics of these bridges are fascinating. The Quishuachaca Bridge, which still spans the Apurimac River Gorge today, is the perfect surviving example of this technology.
The bridge is constructed entirely out of twisted ichu grass, a tough native plant found in the highlands. The engineering process relies on massive communal labor.
Let's break down the mechanics of weaving a bridge capable of supporting tons of weight. It starts small. The local community members gather vast quantities of the ichu grass.
They twist the small blades together to form thin cords. They take those thin cords and braid them together to form thicker ropes.
Then they take those ropes and weave them into massive, continuous cables that are as thick as a human torso.
They anchor these massive grass cables to massive stone abutments built on either side of the terrifying drop of the canyon.
They string the primary cables across the void to form the floor and the handrails, and then weave secondary ropes between them to create the walkway.
Because the organic grass material naturally degrades over time due to weather and use, the bridge must be completely cut down and rebuilt annually.
This process is entirely managed by communal labor, maintaining the vital infrastructural links of the empire.
These roads and bridges enabled the state to rapidly deploy military forces to suppress rebellions. and they facilitated the continuous movement of goods.
The heavy logistics of transportation relied primarily on massive llama caravans. The llama is highly adapted to the high altitude and possesses padded hooves that do not grind down and destroy the paved stone roads like the hard hooves of a horse would.
However, while the llama is adapted, it is limited. A single llama can only carry a maximum load of about 30 kilograms of freight.
Furthermore, they move slowly, traveling only about 20 kilometers in a single day.
To move a significant surplus, the state required immense volume. They organized caravans consisting of hundreds, sometimes thousands of llamas, driven by specialized herdsmen.
These massive, slow-moving trains of animals constantly marched along the paved routes, slowly shifting the heavy burdens of chuño, maize, and textiles from the provincial kolkhoz toward the capital of Cusco, or outward to supply the military garrisons on the frontiers.
The physical freight moved at the slow pace of a llama, but the administrative information directing that freight moved with incredible velocity.
This rapid communication was achieved through the Chasqui relay system.
The Chasqui system was the high-speed data network of the ancient Andes. The state constructed small, dedicated way stations called tambos.
These tambos were spaced at regular intervals every few kilometers along the entirety of the main road network. The state stationed young, highly athletic, specifically trained runners at these posts.
Let's examine the mechanics of how a message was transmitted. If an urgent situation arose, perhaps a provincial governor in the north needed to alert Cusco to an impending rebellion, a chasqui would be dispatched from the provincial capital.
He would carry a quipu containing the precise numerical data of the threat, along with a complex, memorized verbal message providing the narrative context.
He would sprint at absolute top speed down the paved road toward the first tambo.
As the exhausted runner approached the station, he would pull out a pututu, which is a horn made from a massive marine conch shell.
He would blow the horn, sending a loud, echoing blast down the road to signal his imminent arrival.
The runner stationed at the receiving tambo hears the horn. He steps out onto the road and begins running in the same direction, matching the pace of the arriving chasqui.
The handoff occurs while both men are in full motion. The first runner passes the quipu to the fresh runner.
Simultaneously, he recites the memorized verbal message. The second runner repeats the message back to ensure accuracy, grabs the quipu, and sprints off toward the next tambo.
The first runner stops and rests.
This relay cycle continues relentlessly, day and night, across the mountains.
Using this specialized human relay, a vital piece of information, or even a small, lightweight luxury item, such as fresh marine fish caught on the coast and sent to the emperor in the highlands, could travel distances of up to 240 kilometers in a single day.
This allowed the central administration in Cusco to receive data, process it, and issue commands with remarkable speed, constantly rebalancing the complex economic distribution of the empire.
But there is a crucial caveat regarding the Kapak Man that emphasizes the totalitarian nature of the state. This massive, meticulously engineered road network was not a public highway system.
It was strictly reserved for state and military use. The general populace, the common farmers of the ayllu, were not permitted to simply pack their belongings and take a trip to visit the next valley.
Freedom of movement did not exist. To travel on the imperial roads, an individual required explicit physical permission from state administrators.
The bridges were guarded. The tambos acted as checkpoints. It was a closed, highly monitored system.
This underscores the absolute central control of the economy. Your life was geographically bound. You remained in your designated ayllu, you worked your designated state quotas, and you did not move unless the state drafted you and ordered you to march.
Pulling back from the mechanics of the roads, the storehouses, and the quipus, we must evaluate what this entire interlocking apparatus reveals about the nature of Inca power and ultimately why it collapsed so rapidly.
The Inca economy achieved a logistical reality that seems fundamentally impossible to our modern market-driven sensibilities.
They successfully fed an empire of millions, they actively averted widespread famine during periods of severe climate oscillation, and they built monumental infrastructure that continues to stand centuries later.
And they executed this entire operation without spending a single coin, without the existence of a single merchant, and without a single commercial market.
They utilized sheer human organization to turn the steepest mountains on Earth into a unified, cashless superpower.
It stands as a profound historical testament to the capabilities of absolute central planning and hierarchical cooperation.
However, the architecture of their success was also the architecture of their vulnerability. This total reliance on massive top-down redistribution made the entire system incredibly fragile.
When an economy relies entirely on the state to direct every movement of calories, it is highly vulnerable to any disruption at the very apex of the political hierarchy.
Even before the catastrophic end, there were deep structural strains placed on the system. The state's continuous escalating demands for middle labor severely depleted the workforces in the rural villages.
The local nobility, the curakas, were trapped in a highly stressful position. They faced immense friction as they attempted to fulfill the massive labor and production quotas demanded by the central authorities in Cusco, while simultaneously trying to keep their own kin groups from collapsing from exhaustion.
When the central state pushed the labor quotas too hard, the illusion of reciprocal obligation shattered. Local rebellions sparked across the provinces.
The state was forced to expend vast amounts of its stored resources and military labor simply to suppress its own population and maintain the flow of goods.
And then the ultimate disruption fractured the system. Before Francisco Pizarro and the main force of Spanish conquistadors even initiated their primary military campaign in the 1530s, the biological vanguard of Europe arrived.
Devastating diseases, primarily smallpox, swept down the Andes, moving faster than the Spanish themselves.
The virgin soil epidemic decimated the indigenous population. The disease did not spare the elite. It killed the reigning Sapa Inca, Huayna Capac, and his immediate heir.
This sudden vacuum of power at the absolute center of the command economy triggered a massive, highly destructive civil war for the throne between two rival factions.
The infrastructure of the state was turned inward, destroying itself. By the time the Spanish arrived in force and captured the newly victorious Emperor Atahualpa at Cajamarca in 1532, they effectively decapitated the central planning apparatus.
Because the entire economy was completely dependent on centralized state enforcement, because it relied entirely on the quipu issuing orders and the elite administrators managing the physical flow of goods, the removal of the ruling class caused the entire complex logistical network to freeze.
There were no decentralized market forces to fall back on. There were no independent merchants, no poteteca, who could step in and independently facilitate the distribution of food when the state stopped giving the orders.
The chain of command vanished. The massive kolkas were looted, the incredible suspension bridges fell into disrepair, the Chasqui relay halted, and the cashless empire shattered into disconnected pieces.
The rapid collapse highlights the inherent vulnerability of a hyper-centralized, embedded economy. It is a highly efficient machine, but it requires constant, unchallenged authority to function.
When the command center is destroyed, the distribution of survival itself stops. As we conclude this deep dive into Tawantinsuyu, consider the structural rigidity of their design.
The Inca economic engine was engineered perfectly to manage geographic verticality and standard seasonal variability through absolute centralization and massive physical stockpiling.
They could weather a severe winter or a localized drought by opening the kolkhoz. But because the system completely lacked decentralized markets, because there was no independent mechanism for price discovery that could naturally adapt to new conditions without waiting for an order from Cusco, we must ask how this rigid top-down system would have fared if faced with an unprecedented multi-decade climate shift that simply outlasted their massive 7-year food reserves.
If the kolkhoz finally ran completely empty, would the cultural social contract of reciprocity have held the society together? Or would the cashless empire have starved itself from the top down, trapped by the very administrative rigidity that made it so powerful?
It forces us to question the ultimate limits of central planning and the true resilience of human societies when faced with changes outside their engineered parameters. Thank you for listening. Histronabs. Learn history visually.